Hello everyone, my name is Mark Titley. I'm a research associate at Trace. I'm going to spend the next 25 minutes or so talking to you about what Trace is, how we map the supply chains of agricultural commodities that are driving deforestation. Show you how you can access our data yourself, including a demo of our new website, and finally leave plenty of time for a Q&A in case anybody has any questions. Trace is not an organization, but it is a program and a partnership that is shared between two founding partners, the Stockholm Environment Institute and Global Canopy, which is an NGO based in Oxford. As well as that, we work with a variety of other partners, academic partners and NGO partners, and this enables us to tap into lots of different kinds of expertise and is really core to how we work at Trace. Trace is predominantly funded by donors. Their very generous support. We very much rely on that, and without which we cannot do any of the things that I'm going to be presenting today. Trace is a data-driven transparency initiative that maps the international trade of agricultural commodities that drive tropical deforestation. So the core of what we do is this supply chain mapping, linking consumer markets and trading companies to deforestation impacts in producer regions. We also produce what we call insights off the back of this data, which are pieces of analysis, policy briefs, case studies, showing how our data can be useful. At Trace, we like to say we map the middle part of supply chains. So we connect consumer markets and trading companies to sourcing regions and associated deforestation impact in these regions. What I'm saying really is that we don't have full farm to fork coverage, but instead we focus on this really key part of the supply chain that connects those producer locations and deforestation impacts to consumer markets. By focusing on this part of the supply chain, it's kind of a trade-off between supply chain detail and geographic scope. So by doing this, we're able to cover a lot more countries and commodities. And it's also constrained a bit by data availability. And this is the part of the supply chain that we're able to map most easily. But by doing so, we've now mapped about 70% of the global trade in agricultural commodities that are linked to deforestation. In terms of the commodities and countries that we cover, we have quite a big focus in South America, especially Brazil, where we cover soy, corn, beef, chicken, pork, coffee, cocoa, and cotton. We also cover selected commodities in Paraguay, Argentina, Ecuador, Colombia, and most recently, we've added a data set on Bolivian soy. In Asia, we focus on oil palm and wood pulp and shrimp from Indonesia. And in Africa, we have data on cocoa from Côte d'Ivoire. A key thing to point out actually is that although we cover very selected producer countries where deforestation rates are highest for these commodities, for each data set that we cover the entire export market. So if you go to our data set on Brazilian soy, for example, it covers every export of Brazilian soy in that year, which we think is really useful. And so any destination country for that soy will be included in our data. Now on to the use cases of Trace and who is using it. First, we're used by companies who can use our data to understand their own exposure to deforestation from their supply chains. So this is particularly useful if those companies know which trading companies they might be purchasing commodities from, for example, and then they can use our data to try and understand hotspots in those producer countries or inform dialogue and engagement with those suppliers. We're also used by importing country governments, increasingly so, to help inform policy, understand their exposure to deforestation, trends over time, which countries and commodities they might be most exposed to deforestation in, and that sort of question, and essentially help them design more effective legislation and make sure that's well informed. We're also used by investors and financial institutions to screen portfolios for deforestation risk and exposure and understand how they might need to engage with companies in their portfolio on the issue. We're also used by NGOs and the media to hold some of these other organizations to account. Now, to show you a bit more about what our data looks like, this first slide actually is not trace data. This is the kind of typical trade data that's available if you go to resources like Comtrade or FAO or FAO, showing, in this case, the trade of soybeans from Brazil to destination markets. And this is quite useful information. It shows us the amount of soy flowing from Brazil to different countries. We can see, for example, that China was a major export market for Brazilian soy in 2020. And whilst this is useful, it only tells us so much. It doesn't tell us anything about the companies that are involved in these supply chains. And crucially, if we're trying to understand something like deforestation, it doesn't tell us anything about where in Brazil that soy has come from, which is really important for something that's very spatially concentrated, like deforestation. And so for that, we need much more granular subnational information, and that is the gap that Trace tries to fill. So now, zooming in on trace data, if we zoom in on that flow from Brazil to China, trace data shows where in Brazil that soy is likely to have come from, and by overlaying that information with information on deforestation, we can start to ask, where is China most exposed to deforestation? And so we think it's most likely to be in the northern Cerrado, here shown in the darker red colours, and also in the southernmost part of Brazil, in the Pampa grasslands. What's quite striking about a lot of our data sets is they show just how concentrated the problem is. So for example, half of China's deforestation exposure comes from just 30 municipalities, or 7% of the soy that it's importing from Brazil. As well as seeing how concentrated this exposure is geographically, we can also see how concentrated it is in particular companies. So just 10 traders exported 85% of that deforestation exposure, for example. So we hope that this is why trace data is useful. Initially, something that's very complicated and quite opaque can be made much simpler, with much clearer entry points, with clear places and companies to engage with. I'll just pause the presentation here to show you our website and how you can access our data yourself. So if you go to trase.earth, this will take you to our homepage. If we scroll down, we can see the main users that I've just walked you through briefly. So you can click on those pages to get a bit more detail about those use cases and some examples of how governments or companies and finance institutions have used our data in the past. Scrolling down further, you then get to our Explore Our Data tool. You can also reach this by selecting the Explore the Data button in the top right corner. From here, you then have the option to select particular commodities, particular countries or particular commodities. So if you were interested in any data that we have on Brazil, for example, you could just select Brazil. It will produce some kind of key statistics about the data that we have. And you can press Explore Brazil, and it will pull together all the different data sets that we have. So you can see we have data on beef, chicken, cocoa, coffee, and various kind of key headline statistics on those different contexts, as we call them. If you select the more details, it will take you through to the specific page for that commodity. Scrolling down, something else that's new for our new website is a spatial data portal. So here you can see data sets that's specific to Brazil, but not necessarily specific to a particular commodity. So here it's showing what we call territorial deforestation. So that's deforestation that's happening at the municipality level, regardless of the commodity that might be linked to that. Now, say we weren't interested in Brazil in general, but we were interested in a particular commodity. If we go back to that menu, we could look at a particular commodity such as coffee, and it would show us particular data sets that we have on coffee supply chains. But now I'm going to show you what happens if we zoom in on a particular commodity and country combination, because that's where our data is most informative. So if we go to Brazil, and I'll show you our soy data, which is a very popular data set that we produce. Select Brazil soy. It will take you to the Brazil soy page. At the top, we can see some key statistics. We can see the volume of soy produced over time and the deforestation in total associated with that production over the time series. We can see some summary stats of the most important companies by deforestation exposure, hotspots at the subnational level, where that deforestation is taking place, and the most important importing countries. So this is telling us here that 5 countries are exposed to 84% of the deforestation linked to Brazil soy exports. And China is by far the most important destination market at the country level. If we scroll down, we can see an explainer which will walk you through some of our data and the key facts and insights that we can pull from that data. And finally, scrolling down further, you get to our Data Explorer tool. Here, by default, it's showing flows of Brazilian soy in terms of just the trade volume in tons from municipalities of production through particular exporters, importers, and the country that is importing that soy. Now, it might be that you're interested in other things. You might be interested in which ports are the soy is being exported from. Or perhaps you're interested in which biome within Brazil this is coming from. Maybe you're just interested in the Cerrado, for example. And you can select different options to visualize from the left here. So let's say we choose biome. Now we can see the soy being produced in the Cerrado and where that's ending up, or in the Atlantic forest, or in the Amazon. Currently, this is just showing the trade volume in tons, but we can also show this in terms of deforestation exposure or other metrics by choosing from this metric menu here. So let's change it to soy deforestation exposure. And now if we hover the cursor over it, we can see the amount of soy deforestation exposure is being passed through the supply chain. We can see here that pretty much all of it is concentrated in the Pampa and the Cerrado biomes. We can also zoom in on particular flows by clicking on them. So perhaps you're just interested in a particular exporter, or maybe you're interested in a particular country. So we could just click on China and it will filter the data to just show the flows that are destined for that country. However, it might also be that you want to select a country that you can't see just from this overview. So let's say we wanted to look at the United Kingdom's imports of soy and exposure to deforestation. To do that, if we go down to the filter option on the left, there are various different ways we can filter the data. But let's say we're interested in what the United Kingdom is importing, so we could select country of first import. We can search, so I could type in United Kingdom, select that option, and press save. It'll now update the diagram just to show those flows of soy and the associated deforestation exposure to the UK. So here we can see in 2020, the UK was exposed to 1,400 hectares of deforestation. Pretty much all of that came from the Cerrado biome, really from just a handful of municipalities. And that all of that, well, a significant proportion of that was exported by Cargill, along with a couple of other exporters. So that's just actually one way of visualizing the data that we have. There are other ways you can explore this too. So you can produce a simpler ranking or bar chart. Here it's still showing, filtered by the United Kingdom, showing the most important biomes. But again, from the options on the left, we could choose to show the exporters, for example. If we remove that United Kingdom filter, we can go back to looking at all of Brazil's soy exports and the most important trading companies. We can see how these are varied over time by selecting the over time tab, and that will produce a line graph. And finally, we can produce a map, which will show us at the subnational level where deforestation is taking place for soy. This is at the state level at the moment, but on the left here we could change it to municipality, and that gives us much more granular information, which is similar to the map that I showed you in the presentation. You can download any of this data that you've generated from this tool in various formats, such as Excel or CSV. You can also download the images if you want to use those. Finally, the last thing I'll show you is if you wanted to bulk download the whole data set that we have for a particular country and commodity. So at the top, if you go to the Open Data button, this just gives you an overview of all of the countries and commodities and the years that are available for download. So let's say we're interested in Bolivian soy. We could click View. It will show you how to cite that data, when it was last updated, links to our methods documentations if you're interested in understanding how that data was put together. And then you can have the option to download as a CSV file the full data set itself. So I'll finish the demo there and go back to the PowerPoint presentation. In the next part of this talk, I'm just going to share briefly how we actually do this and map these supply chains, because I think it's quite useful information for interpreting the data that we have. So at Trace, we start with per shipment trade records. These are typically customs declarations or bills of lading, and these detail the country that imported that commodity, the port of import, the traders that were involved, and usually gets us as far as the port of export in the producer country. Our next step is to work backwards from there and work out which facilities in the producer country that those shipments came from. So by facility, this could be soy crushing or storage facilities. In the case of palm oil, it might be mills or refineries or slaughterhouses for beef. The final step is to link those, what we call logistics facilities, back to the production locations. Something important to mention is that all of the data that we use is publicly available. And what we do is then piece those different data sets together, repurpose them, and try and piece together that supply chain. We do this using a logic-based decision tree, which tries to stitch these data sets together just according to what we know. So if we know that a particular trader is involved and we know they own certain facilities in that country, then we can make that sort of connection. Where we can't make those sorts of connections throughout the whole supply chain, we also use some mathematical modeling. This is often very useful for this final step, linking those processing facilities to production locations. And so in that modeling, we will take into account things like transportation costs, road networks, the capacities of facilities, and the amount of production taking place at the municipality level to optimize the allocation of that commodity back to where it was produced. In terms of the different data sets that we put together, as I say, we start with those shipment records and we combine that with information on processing facilities, on their ownership, their capacities, their coordinates, their specific locations. We then often use other supply chain connections depending on the country and the commodity. So for palm oil in Indonesia, for example, we make use of disclosed traceability reports by companies. In the case of beef, we use information on how cattle are being moved around within Brazil, for example. Or if we know that a particular shipment is halal meat, we can link it to specific halal slaughterhouses. We use information on domestic transport and road networks, as I've mentioned in the modeling steps. We use production data, and finally, we use measures of jurisdictional sustainability. And by that, I mean impacts in those producer regions, such as deforestation or greenhouse gas emissions linked to deforestation. The last step is to link those supply chains to those deforestation impacts, and what we call deforestation exposure. To do this, we use a spatially explicit method, overlapping maps of soy coverage in the export year. So in this example, it's 2019. And then we overlap that with deforestation that's taken place in a recent window of time. In the case of soy, we use a 5-year window. So if we were looking at soy exported in 2019, we'd look for deforestation in 2014, 2015, 2016, 2017, and 2018. We get that overlapping area, which we call soy deforestation in 2019. And in this cartoon example, let's say we've got 50 hectares. The final step is then to allocate that through those supply chain flows. We do that proportionally by volume, according to how much a particular country or company is sourcing from that municipality. So let's say 1,000 tons of soy being produced here, and we know that 2 traders from our supply chain mapping are sourcing from that municipality in a 40-60 split by volume. We then split that 50 hectares of deforestation in the same ratio. So we'd say that trader A was exposed to 20 hectares of deforestation, and trader B is exposed to 30 hectares of deforestation. An important point to make with this approach is that whilst we are using very detailed subnational information and a spatially explicit method, we can't link particular companies concretely to particular pieces of deforestation. But what we can say is that a particular company is very likely to be sourcing from places with recent deforestation for that commodity. And that's what we mean by deforestation exposure. In the final part of this presentation, I will just share some impact highlights or examples of how trace has been used by other people and projects that we've been involved with. So we worked with the French government to produce a dashboard powered by trace to highlight the risks of being exposed to deforestation from different importers. And this actually resulted in a really nice dialogue between importers, between the French government, and involving ourselves to try and understand where hotspots of deforestation were in France's imports. Trace data also underpins research done by the Tropical Forest Alliance and China Agricultural University to recommend actions that the Chinese government could take to address the impact of beef imports from Brazil. We've worked with financial institutions and investors such as Storebrand. In this case, they combine trace, which gets estimates of deforestation exposure, with Forest 500, which is an initiative to rank and score companies based on their performance relating to deforestation, to produce a risk ranking in their portfolio, prioritize which companies to engage with, review and track progress over time, potentially even divest from companies that were failing to make progress. We've also done work commissioned by national governments, most recently Belgium and also Germany, mapping their exposure to imported deforestation. And for this, we actually took a slightly broader approach that combined the really granular detail that I've shown so far today with a more global picture of what's going on at the national level as well. Related to that, colleagues at SEI have also been working on something called the Global Environmental Impact of Consumption Indicator, or GEEC as we're calling it. And this can tell you the amount of deforestation or other environmental impacts like biodiversity impacts or water use associated with the consumption of different countries around the world. And this indicator has now been adopted as a component indicator under the Convention on Biological Diversity, which was adopted in 2022 at COP15. Finally, we also produce policy briefings. So if anyone is listening from a policy audience or is interested in staying up to speed with policy developments, we've produced briefings, for example, on the European deforestation regulation. Also, I think something really useful in that is there's a table which compares that legislation to similar but different legislation that's also in the works in the UK and the US as well. We've also done a policy brief with ProForest, which provided principles and recommendations for the risk benchmarking system that the EU will have to implement as part of its regulation. I'll finish the presentation there. Thank you so much for listening. Do check out our new website and please give us feedback. There's the option at the bottom of the page to type in any comments or suggestions that you have, which we find super helpful. For any information on future webinars like this one, if you find it useful and you think other colleagues might benefit from it, do share. We run them at pretty regular intervals, every 2 months or so. Do join our mailing list if you haven't already done so. And if you have any questions, then drop us an email at info@trase.earth and myself or a colleague will get back to you.